So without further ado, I would like us all to give Liz Ward a wonderful welcome, and you can take on over. Liz, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for that nice introduction, Mark, and thank you, Johanna, and thanks to Sama for letting our guests have a wonderful trip down the Mississippi and see my work again, even though the show is closed. So I'd like to start with these two images, which represent the inspiration for this series of drawings that Mark mentioned. On the left, this old gentleman is actually my great-grandfather, and he was a steamboat captain on the Mississippi out of New Orleans, where my family is from. And on the right, you see a series of maps. These are geological maps of the ancient courses of the Mississippi River. And what that means is all of the different paths that the river took over time, over geological time, before it was engineered so that it became the navigable channel that we know today. So I loved those maps. I saw them and was very inspired to make artwork from them. There are 15 in this series, and each one of the 15 maps is the source for one of the 15 drawings, 3 of which are in the Sama show, and we will discuss tonight.
Well, great. Thank you, Liz. I mean, this inspiration, must have been very big for you and, leading to the work. So what I want us to do is, like we've done in other happy hour tours, I want us to take a moment, like we always do, and I want us to look at one of Liz Ward's works of art. And I want us to kind of dissect it and to understand it. And, since that we have Liz here to explain it to us, let's see what our interpretations are about. Let's see if our, ideas about this work of art are correct, or if they're wrong, or, give even Liz a new insight to what it is we're seeing. So take that moment. Let's spend about 30 seconds just looking at this work of art, and we'll reconvene and we'll talk about what it is that we are seeing. So questions either in the chat box or whenever you'd like to, you can say them out loud. So, who would like to break the ice with this one?
I would. This is Rosario.
Oh, hi, Rosario.
Hi, how are you?
Wonderful. So tell us what it is that you're seeing.
Well, I can imagine that this is the confluence of the river as it goes down the path. But I was wondering if Liz had a particular spot that she might have painted. To me, this is probably not in the Delta, but further north, but I don't know.
Yeah. Should I go ahead and?
Yeah, please do, please do. Yeah, you're the expert here, Liz.
Thank you, Rosario, for your question. And so, yes, this is from a spot farther north. I can't remember exactly because I made this back in 2015, but I think the title gives us a clue to the meaning of this piece. And it's called Dismal Swamp Northern Lights. And so the title was cued from an actual place name on the map that I used as a source. There was a place called Dismal Swamp on that source map. And I just loved the kind of narrative that implied. And I also have been reading a lot of history about the Mississippi River and in the American period. So you had many, many slaves who would use the Mississippi River as an escape route to the north. And the way these watercolor washes that you see suggested to me the Northern Lights, I decided to play off of that cue, and along with the title, the place name, Dismal Swamp, to call this piece Dismal Swamp Northern Lights, and to evoke the idea of the river as an escape route for slaves, which it really was.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question, if there is a place in line.
Of course, please do ask.
Okay, I'm definitely looking at this artwork and noticing 3 distinct lines, a blue, a red, and a black. I'm thinking blue is water,
Ah,
Red is blood.
yes,
Wow.
What is black?
it's fabulous.
I'm sorry?
I love that, the way that you're noticing those color cues, and I really appreciate that. Yes, and I think those are all perfectly apt. Those different lines represent the different courses of the Mississippi River over geological time that I mentioned in my introduction. And so when I was making these, I would pick out a few of the different courses. I couldn't represent all of them because it was such a tangle of impenetrable interweaving lines. But I think that the red as blood is completely appropriate for this subject matter. The blue referencing water completely. And you see a little waterfall image in that detail. I think of these as landscapes, above all, landscapes seen from different points of view, temporal and spatial. And I think the black is kind of a menacing, dramatic color cue. And so I think, you know, I really appreciate your insight into what you're seeing there.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I have a question to jump on about that with the three lines. Do they all kind of like intertwine with one another? Do they have some sort of like conjunction? Like you can't have one without the other two?
Absolutely. So I think in a upcoming slide, we can see some of the Fisk maps up close. The Fisk was the geologist who made these. Yeah. So here you can really see this, how the geological map is the source for the drawing, and how I picked out certain bits of it to include. And so they do cross and intermingle, absolutely, as the river flows across the alluvial plain over time, for sure.
Wow.
I have a comment, a question.
Oh, please do.
Is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
Miss Ward, I'm taken by the background of the painting, the gray speckling. I don't want to call it speckling, but your canvas or the preparation of the background.
Yes.
I see figures and all sorts of things.
Sure.
Can you kind of discuss the, I guess that's the land and the people and the, it's all gray, and I'm really taken with that background.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you noticed that. That is actually, that's tissue paper that's from a pattern called Toile de Jouy, which is a French kind of fabric design that was really popular in the South. My grandmother had Toile de Jouy curtains and bedspreads in her house.
Oh, yeah.
It's really, it has a couple of different meanings for me. It's an early childhood memory. Those landscapes, the little shepherds and shepherdesses and the flowers and the birds and the boats that I used to kind of gaze at when I was at my grandmother's house. But
That's
also,
interesting.
yeah, but also I think of it as kind of this genteel Southern European civilization overlaid on this wild land of America, if you think of it in historic terms. So I used it throughout the series. We'll see a little bit more, we'll see it in a little bit more detail later on, but it's a really important element of the series.
The technique, did you lay it over the canvas first?
Yeah, these are actually works on paper. So
Oh, okay, okay.
the collage element, and as this series progressed in the later works, there's a lot of collage. So what I would do is collage, it's actually tissue paper in this piece, tissue paper, toile tissue paper, and then I would paint it as well. So there's layers of paint on the toile tissue paper and under it as well. It's kind of transparent.
Thank you. Thank you. Interesting.
Carolyn or Caroline, I think, has also a comment.
Yes, I just wanted to comment on the La Toile de Jouy, which, by the way, I grew up in France, and my room had that Toile de Jouy on the wall. It was red instead of being purple, but definitely they always portray idyllic, bucolic kind of settings, and to have just juxtaposed that with the wildness of the river, I think is very touching. I saw your exhibit already. Of course, I was so happy. I went to the opening, and it's an honor to speak to you, but I think it was genial to have juxtaposed these two things together. And also the idea of mixing of the cultures is very dear to me and very beautiful. So,
oh, thank you so much. Your comments are very moving to me. And my family in Louisiana was very French, and they were from the first Acadians that came to Louisiana 7 generations ago. So, and then as I grew up, I went to France. I lived in France for about 5 years. I'm drinking a Rosé de Provence, actually. So. Salut.
I'm drinking a Dubonnet. I'm drinking a Dubonnet.
Well, so I really thank you so much for your kind words and
Sure.
insights.
Great.
So with this piece right here, Liz, would
Yeah.
this have been a further kind of detail of showing the figures? And
Yeah.
where would you get this type of material? How do you find this?
Well, you know, it was a simple online search. I was actually looking for toile de Jouy fabric, and I came across just a simple Google search, this tissue paper, and which was so much better for what I'm doing, collage. So I ordered, you know, basically a lifetime supply of it. And I've used it extensively in these pieces. It's wonderful because I can paint it, I can burn it, I can tear it, I can do all these, crinkle it up. But here I think you see the idea of landscape. So
Yeah.
a little mirrored image of the landscape. I was imagining if you're traveling down the river, this is something you might see from a boat, the landscape along the shore. You see these watercolor washes that suggest weather, water, the northern lights, as I said. And then you see the little toile de Jouy figures in this idyllic, bucolic, as someone said, landscape. So all of these ideas layered together here.
Wow. And if we were talking about the process of it, was it a time-consuming process? Is this very tedious? Was it? Can we talk a little bit about that?
I'd love to. Yeah, the process is interesting. So I have a really clear structure when I start. I have a certain section of the map that's going to be the compositional structure. And I've traced the courses of the river that I want to include. And I project that onto a big piece of paper. These are 6 feet tall, right? Start with just very expressive watercolor washes, and I have maybe a palette idea, a color idea in mind in advance. And so it starts off very intuitively, and then it becomes a series of formal problems to resolve. These are very, very difficult pieces to work out. They take me a long time. So
Yeah, I can only imagine.
it's an enjoyable process. It's a very additive process. And so
From the comment / question chat box, Gloria is really enjoying the detail of the landscape. And Michelle said that she initially thought this was inlaid with the material of a mineral of some sort, like jade or the inside of a seashell. It really, it drew her closer in for a slower look with these kind of details, yeah.
Michelle, and in fact, the watercolors I use, many of them are called natural mineral pigments. So they really do embody parts of the landscape, the way that sedimentation works. You can see the patterns in this detail in particular. There's all these patterns in those washes that come from the mineral sedimentation. So I'm very interested in the physical embodiment of those minerals in the actual material.
Mark, can I ask a question? Are you right now?
Please, ask a question.
With your works, I'm interested if it ever occurred or you thought about it intentionally that these long rips between that signify the river, it kind of looks scorched, burned, almost as this kind of flaying of edges. Was that purposeful, or it kind of just worked out to be that way with the watercolors?
That's a great question, Johanna. So I think the scorching, burning, flaying, I mean, would you read the history of the South in particular, it is a really violent, tragic story. And, you know, there's great beauty in the river, but there's also a lot of horror in the history. And the fact that the river was so integral to the sugar and the cotton plantation economies is definitely, you know, I read all of this history and it just kind of became embodied in the pieces. I can't say specifically I did this mark or whatever, but I think just ingesting all of that, all of those stories and all of that pain and tragedy comes out in ways that maybe you're seeing.
Right.
And in pieces, not ones that we're talking about today, so we want to get into it too much. I actually did burn the poil. I have a piece called Strange Fruit that really goes to that specifically.
Thanks.
Well, thank you for those questions. So we can now move on to the next piece of work. Here we have it, and we're able to once again see a corresponding with the map and of the other piece. How did things progress, Liz, from the first work to this work?
Basically, they became more and more complicated. And the other challenge was that I had set myself the challenge of making 15 of these, making one drawing for each section of the map. So I had to keep inventing new ways of doing that because I didn't want to repeat myself. I didn't want them to look the same. So farther along I got with the series, the more difficult that became. This piece in particular is really complicated, and I'm glad we have some details coming up because it's really, really layered. And in this one, I really got into the personal history, incorporating collage elements that are actual artifacts of my own personal history. I made this when I was in Michigan. As Mark mentioned, I do live part of the time in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the summers. And so I was up there one fall. I was on sabbatical, and it was really getting cold. It was really getting cold, and the light was this silvery blue-gray. So I always try to be open to what's going on around me when I'm making these, so that I let that kind of information enter into the work. So the palette here was really cued off of that cold, silvery gray light that I was experiencing in Michigan. And then I started thinking of that idea of the cold blue norther, which we San Antonians, we Texans know that when those cold blasts come down from the north. And this section of the map includes this town of Natchez, Mississippi. So I put all that together with this title and the sort of the colors of the Army of the North, the blue in the Civil War. Just so many things go through my mind when I'm making these. I'm just trying to unpack them a little bit for you, but this one is super complicated. It has a whole lot of ideas and information in it.
So Liz, when you started with your original idea of doing these pieces, how much did things change as you progressed throughout the process of making each one of these works of art?
Quite a bit, because all the while I was reading and researching and just living, you know, experiencing. And I think they became more intentional as I went on. Like I really focused in more on the content, the places in each map rather than just the formal elements. So like the Natchez idea here became really important. Natchez, a really important town in Mississippi in terms of the plantation economy, and it was occupied during the Civil War by the Union soldiers. It's a place name I remember hearing about as a kid. So all of that, I hope that answered your question.
It did. Thank you, Liz.
And we have a question. I think Carolyn, is it Carolyn or Caroline?
Caroline is fine.
Okay, Caroline, yeah,
Yes,
she said, I have a
thank you.
question.
So the first time I saw this one, I got a feeling of steaminess, such as swampiness. And so, you know, I associated it with the Mississippi River and the swamps, which goes to show that every person looking at art, it's really their relationship to the art. It's a very personal interpretation. You can see, you were explaining how it was more like cold, like a northern, you know, color, but I actually saw heat in that coolness. So that's really interesting.
It's definitely misty. But you know, that's what makes art, is that each viewer brings their own subjectivity and experience. And I love that. I mean, I love hearing what people see in my work. It's always very gratifying, and that they take the time to interact with it in that way is very meaningful to me.
Mark, can I ask a question?
Of course you can. You don't even have to ask.
So I'm going to reference the paranormal because your works have this kind of ghostly feel, transparent, ethereal maybe, and you refer a lot of ghosts, of things of that nature. And of course, I always associate that kind of with a Southern Gothic tradition. I was just wondering if that was an influence on you, or if that was just, it just so happened to be that way.
Thanks for that, Johanna. Yeah, the series is called Ghosts of the Old Mississippi. And so, you know, that's intentionally chosen. And I would say for me, it's not so much about the paranormal as about being kind of haunted by one's own personal history. And in my case, personal loss of my mother, for example, who died when I was quite young. And you can see here her recipe cards uses collage elements here, and then the references to my great-grandfather. So those are the ghosts I think I'm referring to, and also the ghosts of all of the generations and peoples that have lived and died along the Mississippi River. I also, I've used the term ghosts in other bodies of work, and in many cases it refers to sort of the idea of loss and environmental loss as well. So there's kind of an elegiac tone to a lot of this work, and I'm glad you picked up on that word ghosts. It's very important.
It's very moving.
So we have two questions for you, Liz. Gretchen asked that this piece has a butterfly and another one did as well, and if that signifies anything for you.
Yeah, that's a little bit of, I mean, that's a great question. It's a little bit of a hard question because these are actually moths, and so kind of nocturnal insects. I like the symmetry of them, which relates formally to the symmetry in the detail on the right towards the bottom. You have those Victorian silhouette faces that are doubled, kind of like a Janus figure looking to the past, looking to the future, the god of thresholds, Janus, January, rivers as metaphors of time. Moths, the night, maybe death. I've done projects about the monarch butterfly migration, so I have a lot of monarch or butterfly imagery in my image files. And then these pieces, as I was telling Mark, they became more and more complicated, and I kept pulling things from my past work and kind of using those as resources and recycling images. The moths and butterflies speak to nature, my interest in that, the river, and its natural history as well as its human history. So that's kind of a rambling answer, but I love moths and butterflies, and I use them all the time.
Great. Okay, and another question from Laura is that the background image resembles an Asian landscape, which I know that Mark will and you will touch on a little bit.
Yes, bingo. That's absolutely the case. As one of my very, very important inspirations is traditional Chinese landscape painting, which I adore and am very influenced by in terms of a mode of representing landscape and space, which is really different from the Western approach. And we'll see that later, right? That's right, Johanna.
So please excuse me, Liz, but I have to ask about the veal roast. Was there any particular reason why you chose the veal roast as this card for the recipe here? Why did you choose that? What was your thought process going on with the recipe cards?
I was probably hungry.
You thought that sounded the most delicious. I'll just slap that on there then.
And you know, I don't remember my mother ever making it. Some of them are more specific to certain pieces. That one was kind of random, but it seemed to work. But you know, recipe cards, a lot of women have seen these on the pieces, and I mean, it's not to exclude our male audience members here, but it's a kind of an intimate thing handed down across generations of women. Sadly, probably will not continue in the age of digital recipes, but just these are in my mother's own hand, and they're very precious to me as artifacts of her life, and maybe her aspirations as a housewife.
So it really pretty much connects everything that you've been through and which is important to you in these works of art.
They're really they're very intimate, and I had a hard time kind of parting with them, putting them in the work, but I did scan them all, so I have digital scans of the recipes. Yeah. And
so as an artist, did this process of you being able to express yourself and being able to be intimate with what it was you're producing, did that come naturally? Was that something you developed throughout time? How did that come about?
That's a great question. It was really difficult for me to become this personal with these pieces. I was very reluctant to do that initially. And now I'm just in it 100%, but my work, the bodies of work prior to this were much more abstract and hermetic in a way. So yeah, I felt like I really needed to make, it was kind of at a time when my kids, I have twins, they were going off to college, and it incited a sort of a moment of reflection, memory. I'm not sure what it was, but I just felt like I really needed to go there. And I just said, what the heck, and just did it.
And did this help you express yourself in a way that was, helpful to you in, getting through this time?
Absolutely. And I feel like it's honoring my own ancestors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it just kind of got it out of my system.
Yeah.
And people respond, they really connect with those personal moments, I think.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to what you said and Caroline said as well about how it all, is on, our own selves interpretation of the work of art, and to understand that and to, feel a certain way when we see these pieces. So I think that's extremely touching, and appreciate you sharing that with us. So thank you.
Thanks for the question. Oh, we have a cook in the chat.
Oh, we do. Maybe we can look. Yeah, we see the fried oysters over here. We had a question about somebody wanting to read what exactly it said. You can't really see. I see it brown at 375, turning till roast is brown slightly all over. There you go. You can get a little bit about the famous veal roast right there. So, Liz, talk to us about this piece right here. The final one.
I'd love to. So, this piece is a little bit different. You might notice, or to me it is. This is called Floating Life. It's the last piece in the 15. So I really felt a lot of pressure with this one to really kind of sum it all up in a way and do something different to push it along a little bit, something new. And so with this one, I really focused in on the natural history aspect. You'll see little details of plants and rocks and other things. Yeah, it's very, very layered. I really went with the idea of being in the water with this one, as if you're just floating down the river. You're in the water, maybe even looking up. So I was very kind of expressive and intuitive. I'd say less specific in a way, kind of summing up the whole idea of river, nature, floating, time passing, those sorts of things.
We have a question from the chat. Adrian's wondering if your paintings are somewhat biographical.
Yeah, this series definitely, absolutely, especially that last one with those artifacts. Yes, totally. I mean, not in the traditional sense, but they do have very actual physical personal artifacts included, and they do have to do with this own 7 generations of history in Louisiana that's part of me.
Maybe I don't understand how to read maps, but do you know what's happening with these colors on the original map? What is that? Is that signifying that the river part?
That's the great question, and it's not apparent for sure. So what you see, if you look on the drawing, the yellow line, that's the modern course of the Mississippi River, the way it is now, more or less. And then in the geological map on the right, the white course, yeah, that's being traced here by the cursor. That's the modern contemporary course of the Mississippi River. All of those other colors represent the course of the river in different geological time periods. And there's a legend on the left, yeah, that tells you the geological era that course is from. So it's super complicated. I mean, the man who made these maps is just, it was his life's work. he was a fascinating character in his own right, Harold Fisk. And these are super famous maps in the world of map collecting.
Yeah.
So
I mean, they're visually appealing as well as telling of the time.
Yeah, and I thought of it as the river's memory. Like, this is the memory of the river over time. So the different so here you have the geological time scale, and for me, I'm dealing with the time scale of human generations. So those two things layered over each other.
So would you say, Liz, that the idea of time is pretty much the main idea in which you're trying to get at?
I think it's the unifying idea, the underlying idea. It's an idea I've returned to throughout my work as an artist. Yes, absolutely.
So some chat questions are, which inspires you more, geography or history? That's the first.
I have to think about that one. You know, with these, I would say these geological maps really were the initial inspiration. Like, I think this is amazing. I want to make something with this. And I'd done a lot of work about rivers. But then it got more specific and more in terms of human history and my own personal history. So I'd say, I don't think one is more important than the other. They just kind of became integrated and mingled, and just became added to the complexity of the whole idea. I don't think that was a very good answer.
And then someone asked, for this particular work of art, where did you start? What was the first layer?
I drew out those paths of the river, yeah, and actually masked them with a material called masking fluid. So I painted that over the river so that it wouldn't accept any more watercolor. So it was masked. And then I started throwing down these washes, these really dark blue washes that you see, those kind of stripes of really dark ultramarine blue, yeah. And I let it dry, and it dried in these beautiful patterns, and it really, that sort of cued the whole thing about being in the water, underwater. So I started with the lines of the river, and then that very kind of expressive watercolor wash. And then I just kind of take it from there and try to resolve the pieces. They're very hard to resolve formally. They become a series of formal problems, as I said.
So Liz,
Yes.
as we progress through, you had sent me these two details of what are these? Explain
Okay, so
to me.
these are details of the Toile de Jouy pattern from my great aunt's apartment in New Orleans. And when she died, for some reason I had the foresight. I mean, I was a much younger artist, but I was an artist. And I took those curtains and I Xeroxed them and used that imagery. I started using that imagery years and years ago. And so I made cyanotypes with that imagery. That's a photographic process. It makes a blueprint. And so I started incorporating those old cyanotypes as collage elements in the actual pieces. So I think, Mark, if you go forward to the next image, if you could. Yeah, so you see in the bottom left, that's a little cyanotype collage element from my aunt's curtains. And I loved the nautical imagery for this series. The old sailing ships reminded me of the journey of La Salle down the Mississippi from the Great Lakes in a sailing ship of that sort. Little figures fishing along the shore, ruins, all of that just was so kind of evocative to me that I included that as collage elements for my aunt's Toile de Jouy curtains.
I have a question, if it's okay. How do you, where does the intuitive process stop and the thinking process starts? Because your work is so detailed, it's so elaborate, and yet it feels very free at the same time.
Thank you.
So how do you reconcile those two, or reconcile those two?
A really interesting question. And as you know, I've been working for so many years as an artist that I've come to trust my instincts. And I was listening to the radio the other day, the jazz station Trinity, and someone was talking about the idea of jazz and how jazz musicians have studied and they understand music and they have all this skill, but then they get in this mode of working and it just all comes together in this kind of intuitive flow. And when I'm working at my best, I would say that that kind of describes what's going on. Like, I've had all this experience in making work, and when I'm in that flow, I just kind of go with it. And I've internalized a lot of the things I've read, and I just let them come out, and I just try not to stop myself. You know, I'm solving formal problems, I'm trying to be open for inspiration, and I'm just going with it. And I think that kind of flow is the best way to describe it. And I don't want to sound, you know, highfalutin or bombastic about it, but honestly, it's just, after so many years of working, I just trust that intuition.
So, Liz, when you were talking about the process as you created each of these works of art, when you came to the last piece of this series, you had a lot of pressure, like you were saying, how you wanted to make something really spectacular. How did you overcome that? How did you create this work of art? And then, you know, after you finished, you're like, okay, this is it. This is what I was working for. This is what I achieved. This is what I was going for. How did that process come about?
I guess I'd say it's a little bit like I was just describing. The other thing that happens is there's kind of a moment of recognition, you know, that you're interacting with the work as it's developing over time, and you're doing different things to it, and you're recognizing what's happening, you're responding, you're reacting. And this one, you know, I intentionally wanted it to be a little bit different, So I had set these intentions, and then I just kind of went with it. And then I did, you know, I decided to really focus in on those natural elements, those small details, the idea of being in the water, and I let that drive me as I made these decisions going forward.
And did you feel accomplished? Did you feel like this is it, I did it, when you got to that point?
Well, I'm never sure.
Life for you, right? You'll never be fully sure.
You're always, it's always terrifying.
Yeah.
You never know. But you just kind of go with it. You just say, well, this is what I made. I'm going to go with it. It's very scary.
And, you know, thinking about that is being an artist, or I myself am not an artist, but, you know, whenever I do a piece of work, you know, you always hope that you're doing the best you can, but it's not until you actually dive into that water that you can fully see the outcomes of your results. But I mean, this is truly spectacular, Liz. So,
Oh, thank you. Well, a lot of risk is always involved in making art.
So coming towards the end, talk to a little to us about what we see here with all of the pieces next to one another.
Yeah, so here you can see 3 pieces from across the series, an earlier one on the left. I think you can see the growing complexity and the change from the first to the last. Yeah, so I think, you know, as I worked through the 15 drawings, the whole concept and everything became clearer to me. And there's a lot of time, you know, I started these in 2013, so there are years that went into them. And then on the far right, you see the whole connected Fisk map that we started with. So just the structure of the whole series, there is a drawing for each one of those 15 sections. It's the whole Mississippi River from the Ohio all the way down to the Delta. And yeah, it's a big project.
I bet it is. How long did each one take you?
You know, it seemed like the farther along I got, the longer they took. I would say like 2 months for drawing these last, especially just so much back and forth and adding, subtracting. You know, they're very complicated formally, adjusting all of the colors, the surfaces, the textures. Yeah, it's a big challenge formally to get them to coalesce.
For sure. And at any point, did you feel as though you were like, oh, I kind of want to give up, or you weren't feeling really great about it? Or was there anything that happened during that time?
Oh, yes, all of that. Yeah, and I did other kind of series in between. So there were other projects that came up that I was doing in the meantime. So it wasn't continuous. There were breaks, and then I would return to it and tackle another section of the map.
In this series, Liz, I have a question. This is Rosario. Have you kept them together? Have they been sold separately? What is your intention, since it's a historical evolving situation? It's a work that has grown through the years. What is it that you are concerned about preserving as a whole?
That's a great question. I had this fantasy of them all being shown together, and they are in different collections, mostly in Texas, but they're in private collections. So that just seemed like that would never happen, because they were also shown in different pieces were shown in different exhibitions. Like some were shown in Dallas, some were shown in Houston. And then I was offered a show at the Tyler Museum of Art in Tyler, Texas last year. And their wonderful curator, Caleb Bell, I'm giving a shout out to Caleb, borrowed back almost every single one of the drawings in Texas collections. So there was a show in Tyler all of last summer, and which had almost all of them. And it was just so wonderful for me to see them together. But that'll probably never happen again.
Most of them
On my website, they're all together. And in fact, there's a cool thing on my website where you can go through each one of them down the river and see the drawing fade into the map of the river back and forth. My son did that for me. He's a computer whiz. So they're all together on my website. But I don't think physically they'll probably ever be together again.
So we have a lot of questions and some raised hands. So I'm just going to go in order. So prepare thyself. So Laura was wondering that the work on the left is so different from the other two. And she's wondering, was it made at a different time?
Yes, it was one of the earlier pieces. I think it's 2015. Yeah, and those other two are 2019. So 4 years in between, and they are really different, absolutely. The one on the left is more pure watercolor, and the watercolor is really, I think, carrying the piece. And the other two certainly have a lot of watercolor, but they also have a lot of pastel and other drawing materials, and more layers, more complexity, more collage elements. So yeah, they're quite different.
And then Adrienne was wondering if you ever do redos.
Oh boy. You know, I really, I have this kind of determination to work things out. And so a piece may be at a point where it's not working. I won't say maybe. Often pieces go through periods where they're not working, but I'm like determined to make it work out. So I haven't redone any of it. Is that what you're asking? Yeah, redos.
Yeah, if you just had to start over or something, maybe you didn't.
With these, I've been really determined, and I've tried to work them all out. So I haven't redone any of these.
Okay, and then Caroline has a question, and then Yinchi.
Hi, Yinchi.
Caroline, or no? Maybe okay. Then Yinchi, do you want to just ask her a question?
Yes, I think I had a question earlier about the introduction of writing in work of arts. And, you know, at which moment do you decide to use writing? I have been wrestling with that idea. What form should the writing take? You introduce the recipes and the actual artifact, which is amazing, because to separate yourself from something that is dear to you is really difficult. But if there had been a copy of that writing, it would not have been the same.
No, absolutely.
So the sacrifice. So anyway, I'm just interested in the introduction of writing in works of art, whether it's handwritten characters, letters, recipes, etc. Thank you.
I think it's a totally valid approach, but you know, in our culture, text has so heavily weighted. You know, it's a very powerful element to introduce. We read that right away, and it carries a lot of meaning. So it has to be done judiciously, and always telling my students, if they're writing using text in a piece, it has to be formally integrated, and you know, it could be like another voice in the painting or the drawing, but it has to be handled like any other formal element, just as carefully. But it is powerful, right? So that always has to be considered. Yeah.
Yinchi, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, Liz. Your work is so rich with associations, and it's so resonant and brings up so many things for so many of us looking at it. And I guess I'm still thinking about what you and Mark said about time. And particularly just because, you know, being in the situation we're in right now, I think time is kind of passing differently for a lot of us. And so one of the things I'm interested in about your work is that there seem to be these different time scales. There's like the geologic time, which passes, you know, at such a slow rate that we can't even perceive it. But you've kind of illustrated that for us here. And then also, you know, kind of human time, the archive, personal kind of biographical time and your movement from childhood to adulthood. So I just would love to hear you speak more about how those are interacting, I guess, visually, and just more about these different timescales in your work.
Yeah, thanks, Yanxi, and it's so nice to see you there. Yeah, I mean, that's a really important component of this piece, and the layering and the interweaving of let's say, the time that it takes water molecules to come from the source of Mississippi River in Minnesota all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And then all of the different courses of the river over geological time. Yeah, I mean, that geological time is so unfathomable and fascinating always when you see that in rocks and in road cuts and so on. But just overwhelming and impossible to really comprehend, but important. And I think, you know, juxtaposing the sort of insignificant in a way time frame of human generations against that backdrop, it's a little bit poignant. I mean, in a way it reduces human experience to insignificance, but at the same time we can't deny the significance of our own personal histories to ourselves. So that's just some of the things I'm thinking about with time in these pieces.
Well, thank you for that, Liz. And to speaking to time and inspiration, what do we have here? We have, I think it was getting back to Laura's question about the Chinese influence. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, as promised, and Mark was so kind to find this beautiful image from the museum's collection. And as I mentioned, I love classical Chinese landscape painting and look at it quite a bit whenever I'm in a museum or in books as well. So the spatial conception of Chinese landscape painting is so different from Western landscape. Particularly, typically you have a viewer in a specific point looking out at a distant prospect at a certain time of day. So like shadows and light are really important. But the Chinese landscape really speaks about a viewer traveling through a landscape. And so you can see the little figures on the road moving up the picture plane, but back into space at the same time. And so that kind of compositional framework is really, I think, has really informed my own sense of composition. The scroll-like extreme vertical formats that I'm drawn to really speak to traveling through a landscape over time, as is the case with Chinese landscape painting. Yeah, so I'm so happy that we were able to show this to you as a comparison, and that someone picked up on that even before, so yeah.
I have one of the last questions from the chat. Erin is wondering that obviously Hurricane Katrina predates these works of art, but with the fluidity of water and the watercolor, was Katrina at all in mind as you composed these works of art?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Honestly, I can't say specifically that it was, although I think the idea of weather is certainly present. Weather, sky, water, you know, the traditional elements of landscape painting are all part of these pieces, and their concerns with weather. I mean, and flooding too, you know, just flooding in general is really pivotal to some of the other pieces. There's one that's called Yellow Fever Spring Flood, and really it's not in this grouping, but so at other times I've thought about that because that's certainly part of the history of the river and written about so vividly by Mark Twain in Huckleberry Finn, for example, and other works that I reread when I was making this work. So floods for sure, not that one, but floods.
And then Michelle had a question that she said that you have a great eye for visual space. Do you do photography as well? She's just kind of curious.
Thank you. Well, I think I'm not really a photographer. I've done a lot of photography, but mainly non-traditional things like the little cyanotypes I mentioned. That's a photographic process. And I think like most artists, I use photography as kind of a way to collect images that I can reference later. So as a tool, but not as an end product. My husband's a photographer, and so I just leave that to him. He photographed all my work. Thank you, Rob.
Well, on that note, time has passed, and I once again want to thank you, Liz, so much for being with us today and giving us a wonderful time and really getting deep into the insight of your pieces. So on behalf of everyone and behalf of the museum, cheers to you and your wonderful works, and thank you again so much for this. It was wonderful. We appreciate it.
Thank you,
Yes,
Mark.
thank you so much.
And thanks everybody for your wonderful questions. I'm really grateful.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you.
Y'all.
Thank you, and
Thank you.
goodbye, and enjoy the rest of y'all's evening, and be safe and have a great one. Thank you. We appreciate it. Bye-bye.